Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Democracy Tomorrow, the world's only podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding world citizenship. Together with Oneness World, the Hope Movement, and Integrative Psychology and Medicine, we will be hosting a training program for 11 weeks starting in October and lasting all the way until the 17th of December called Democracy Mind. In the lead up to hosting this training program, where we really try to merge the ideas of psychology with the ideas of politics into a framework which enables us to understand better the ultimate objective, which is world citizenship. In the run up to that, we are hosting a series of podcasts with various experts in various aspects of the question of what it takes to ultimately become a world citizen. And these several podcasts will be hosted primarily by Jordan Bakker, who's on the screen with us today. And momentarily, I'll hand the reins of administration to him to host today's podcast with our guest, Tom Brunzell. And we'll explain who he is in a moment. But thanks for listening. And if you have any questions or concerns or comments, please let us know. Please like and subscribe and keep coming back to Democracy Tomorrow. So with that, I'll hand the reins over to Jordan Bakker. Jordan, floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. As Scott was saying, really, this series is all about the idea that the way we think and feel ripples out into the way power and politics work in the world. So we're really wondering, how can we be better citizens? How can we contribute to the evolution of politics? And ultimately, how can we further this notion of world citizenship? So we're very happy today to have the wonderful Tom Brunzell, Associate Professor at Melbourne University. He's an internationally recognized leader in trauma-informed education. He's got a background spanning teaching, school leadership, research, and his work really sits at the intersection of learning science, well-being, and educational equity, with a particular focus on vulnerable students and staff, the staff that support them. Tom helped to create the Berry Street education model, which runs in now more than a quarter of Australian schools. He is the author of some influential books, including Creating Trauma-Informed Strength-Based Classrooms and the recent Trauma-Informed Educational Leadership book. His career also spans continents. So he taught in the Bronx, he co-founded a charter school in Harlem, and now he's worked for over a decade at creating really systems-level impact here in Australia. So we invited Tom because we believe the work he does, helping young people in schools better cater for people's internal worlds, is deeply connected to the outer work of building healthier democracy. So we're really curious to sort of tease out that link. So we kind of are curious, what might a trauma-informed model of citizenship and politics might look like? So that's one of the questions we're kind of holding in the background. So Tom, warm welcome to you.
It's so cool to be here. Hi, Jordan. Hi, Nigel. Hi, Scott. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today.
So Tom, would love to hear a little bit about how you got into this work. So, how did you start out in your teaching? I know that you worked in some pretty challenging environments. So curious about that experience and what it sort of taught you and how it shaped you as a professional.
Yeah, so I was a teacher and a school leader for many, many years in the Bronx and New York City, and then in Harlem, where you said, Jordan, I was a co-founder of a charter school at 137th and Broadway, if you know New York, and a lot of our listeners would. I'd like to say I came of age as a teacher in the age of debates, in the age of reading wars, in numeracy curriculum renovations, in terms of debates around classroom management. And I also want to make sure I ground myself in history. I came of age as an educator in what I would call a horizon point in neoliberal accountability and all of the standards movements. And there were times when I would push against those standards and then realize, you know what, sometimes those standards help the leakiest wheel in the school. And a lot of times that was me. But my career really takes a jumping off point when I considered how do we help students with very dysregulated behavior. I used to call them bad students with bad behavior and naughty students. And now I realize, yikes, I was part of the problem. And I would and have devoted most of my career toward innovation, as we'll talk about today, but also as a bit of a karmic gift to my former teacher self.
Really interesting to kind of, yeah, have that contextualization also in terms of historically and that, I guess, the honesty that, as you said, you're part of the problem. I think we replicate these things if we aren't taught better. So I'm curious about yourself, I guess, as a citizen, as a political figure. So that's a little bit about, the professional backstory, but yeah, curious about how that's evolved.
I appreciate the question. And frankly, everybody, I've been thinking a lot about this since I was asked to be a guest. And I think it's important right off the top to acknowledge that I think my political citizenry began when I was a child because I have, I think, a somewhat intriguing story. I was born in 1974 in Vietnam. And in 1975, when I was 4 months old, I was placed on the final plane of Operation Baby Lift before the fall of Saigon. And so, as a child, and I landed in Los Angeles. As a child, I was raised to consider the place I came from in very hushed tones. That this was a place where democracy, as I was told as a child, had fallen, and that the American shame and the American confusion and anger and resentment around this place, I was never ever told that Vietnam could be a place of cultural strength for me. And I was never encouraged to look beyond America for any sense of cultural identity. So I think a lot about what it means to not have pride or place in one's culture or in one's background. But then I just think it's important for everyone to understand sort of my early childhood values. I was raised with a great deal of material privilege, knowing my own story, knowing that I had some kind of, and was told I had some destiny toward contribution. But I was definitely raised in the height of Reaganism in a church who's put their faith in trickle down economics and a church of prosperity gospel. So you can see that I'm saying this with a bit of a wink and a nod that as a child, I was scolded often for being too effeminate or showing too much femininity. And as a proto gay person, I now can look back and think, oh, that kid who had so much musical talent and flair and love of drama and love for life. I quickly assumed a political position where I needed to fight the power. And so I think a lot around what that instigation mindset was as a child that I think will help frame what we talk about today around contribution. But I also think it's important as I'm landing some of my important values and ideas right here at the top that I was raised as a gay person in the age of the specter of HIV/AIDS, where HIV/AIDS was used as a weapon against queer people, as a political weapon. And so I just think so much around faith and community and the systems of identity. And therefore, here I am.
Can I ask, Tom, that's so much complexity there that
I appreciate that.
you're just kind of outlining in a couple of sentences. The identity as a young gay boy, Vietnamese, prosperity gospel, the United States.
I landed it for you, Nigel.
What what's that like? And given that you've
Yeah.
worked so much with young people
Yeah.
and kind of helping them kind of emerge an identity, because that's our citizenship comes from our grassroots experience. Yeah, what do you learn about that complexity now, reflecting back as an adult? That you can bring to the understanding of what young people have to move through to become
Totally.
citizens.
I think so much around being both an insider and outsider in culture and in communities. And my own childhood, I mean, I want everyone to know I had an incredible childhood. I was validated for the many strengths that I had. I was raised with every Maslow's need basically met, but in the need for self-actualization and transcendence, I often found myself independent. And I think a lot on the tail end of being a Gen Xer, that we might have been some of the most independent people and before the age of internet and everything else. But I also think, Nigel, to directly answer your question, my own sort of scholarship journey tells a bit of a story as well. So if I could drop some breadcrumbs as a way to answer that question, I had the real privilege to attend Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was literally dropped down into postmodern impulses, art theory, and liberation theologies. And as a youngster, thinking a lot about Cornel West and Angela Davis and culturally responsive equity work, and then learning about queer theory, and then kind of trying to understand that as a political identity, I also had sort of a dual pathway toward interfaith studies and interfaith understandings, to the point that I've spent significant time as a young adult in a residence in a Taoist monastery, trying to understand my own faith journey. But as if I can just drop down a couple more tenets to help people understand why I think this way. I'm art trained, and I often think now, I mean, I don't work in the arts, but that has deeply impacted who I am and my ways of contributing. I think so much about the new ways of seeing through my heroes in the Bauhaus and the Russian constructivists who are thinking that design will save us. And I think of the heroes like Malevich and Kandinsky and the abstract expressionists, and this like new way of seeing and new way of being like Rothko and Barnett Newman. And then finally, those of you my friends out there, they know that I care a lot about design and fashion as a way to just keep myself sane. So I think a lot about art process of Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer and Helmut Lang and Rei Kawakubo and Miuccia Prada. And so I think so much about those kinds of influences that help form the way that I see the world. And then what I haven't done yet is drop down my real discipline around well-being sciences and trauma-informed education, which I know we'll get to in a moment.
Wow, Tom, this is news to me. So we've met a few times and had some conversations. It's lovely to hear this really rich tapestry of experiences and influences. I'm curious, like now, how would you describe what your key values are now as it relates to these topics? And yeah, also inviting, like if there's any other kind of key pivotal moments that kind of helped shape them that you haven't covered, would love to hear that also.
I think I've covered a lot. Thank you. It's good. But I also thought it was important because I in my normal life, I don't actually get a lot of opportunity to talk about drawing all these threads together. And so just to be on the podcast with you all, to have an opportunity to think beyond my own disciplines and professional work toward world citizenry, that's an important thing to me. I can certainly now start talking around my work at Berry Street, because that is an incredibly important step to me in terms of contribution to communities. So I realized very quickly back in New York that I needed to learn more and I needed to do more. And at the time, there was a newly emerging paradigm called Wellbeing science, which had a lot of different names. Some would call that positive psychology. I understand that word. Some would call it well-being science. Some initially would call it the sciences of happiness, but that was kind of a marketing mess for a lot of us involved with that. We won't talk about that probably much today. But I also knew concurrently that there were new sciences called trauma-informed practices that originally had its genesis in community action work supporting incarcerated youth and programs supporting youth justice. And then the notion of trauma-informed practice as a systemic play to support communities to move forward together starts sharing its insights into my sectors, which is, of course, education. And so I kept following the leads and following the learning, and that landed me in Australia. And so, yes, I am a dual citizen of Australia and that other place you can guess I belong to. And I stayed in Australia because I live in Melbourne. And Melbourne is super groovy, everybody. If you haven't been to Melbourne, you need to come down here and see us. But I also stayed in Melbourne because I absolutely needed to learn more from Berry Street. So Berry Street is one of Australia's largest child and family welfare organizations, often working with families in the child protection and out-of-home care systems. And so Berry Street was very much at the advent of trauma-informed practices 15 years ago. And I was given an incredible opportunity to take the knowledge and keep iterating and iterating to what became the Berry Street education model, which, Jordan, as you generously shared, is supporting so many Australian schools right now and far beyond. My work at Berry Street absolutely positioned that if we can help students who are made vulnerable by stress, overload, by trauma in early years and early childhood, and support teenagers who need and deserve our support, then we would be, in fact, helping each other understand how to differentiate practice and support healing and growth in our communities. So I'm very, very proud of that work. And I will say I've recently left Berry Street in the good hands of the leadership team there. And I'm an honorary at Berry Street, very proud of that. And I've just joined the University of Melbourne.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I'd really love to dive deeply into the questions around trauma and the role that trauma plays in our world and our thinking. But also, before we kind of move on from this backdrop of who you are, Scott, I'm curious if there's any particular threads that you wanted to inquire about.
There's 50 million threads I'd like to inquire about. But let me try to narrow it down to one or two. So just very interested to get your thoughts on a couple of things related to the relationship between trauma and one's experience with it, and how that contributes to one's worldview, and to extrapolate even further, how that contributes to how one sees politics and who one ultimately votes for. Because in this whole process, working on this broader ultimate destination of world citizenship for everyone, everywhere on a unified planet, where all humans see each other essentially as humans first before any other distinguishing characteristics divide us into various categories and groups or even nation states. There are so many obstacles placed by the real world in the way of people being able to happily embrace all of humanity. And it's very easy to completely and utterly ignore the concept of world citizen, which has been around for millennia. This is not a new idea. This is a very ancient idea that predates most religions, one could say. It's very old. But for some reason, us humans, in our ways, have found it very difficult to create systems which truly reflect our shared humanity. We have a tendency to divide before we have a tendency to unify, and that's playing itself out every single day in all of our newspapers and all of our political circles. We all know this. So the general question would be, from a trauma-based perspective, what can we do generally to try to assist the process of transcending trauma, with the larger objective being creating trust. And I was just reminded of this, coming here today, driving down the road, what a fundamental thing trust is. We don't even think about it. The simple fact that you drive down the road with traffic coming at you, you trust those drivers not to sway into your lane. And it's built in. So there's a trust factor there. And as so many politicians of the current era also know, if we can get the voters to mistrust the system, they're much more likely to vote for us. And trust and trauma, to me, really go very much hand in hand. So maybe you could just comment on a few of those things.
Absolutely, Scott. Trauma means a lot of things to a lot of people, and that word is ubiquitous in our popular culture, in the research, and in everyday life. It's not often that I disagree with when someone uses that word, whether they're very serious about an adversity that maybe have happened in their community, in intergenerational contexts. Certainly here in Australia, that's important to recognize. I also just want to ensure that we define this well. For me, as a teacher person, I'm a teacher, not a psychologist like Nigel is. I'm not a therapist. I'm not clinically trained by the way you are. But I am a teacher. So as a teacher, as an educator, I need to know and assume that there are moments in some people's lives, including my own, when the world does not feel good and safe, that I don't inherently believe that the world is there to catch me. Now, I have experienced adversity, but I've also received a number of pathways and avenues towards support. So I understand what it means to feel like the world is not there to catch me, but I also think of the protective factors, some of which I've already spoken about today. So that's important to define well. I also can start linking that idea, Scott, that you're talking around. Well, if people do not inherently believe the world is there for them, that the world offers avenues of communication, avenues toward regulation. I'm going to drop this word down a lot in our talk today. Trauma-informed practice would say that our goal is to co-regulate one another. So eventually the individual can learn to focus on what matters to them, which is their values, taking the next step forward, proactive support seeking. That trauma disrupts one's ability to mobilize those resources for proactive help seeking or resilience, let's say. And in an unpredictable world, it can feel very risky to us. That unpredictability equals risk. It's something I write about. It's one of my behavior theories that I want to attribute to my friend Jen Kolchin when we got to work together at Berry Street. That this idea of unpredictability equals risk, we can see that on the macro level, that if you cannot depend on your neighbor, that's unpredictable. If you are in a liminal space of a community and transformation, or in its transforming in a way that you don't trust, then that is risky. So you're not going to attend to the driver next to you. You're neurobiologically going to focus on your own survival. And then, and you didn't say this yet, Scott, but I know we have to talk about this, in the specter of AI and the notion of the infinite scroll, this like scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. Like my friends who study this stuff said, yes, there's like there was a consciousness shift that none of us actually maybe realized when technology enabled the scroll. Like we don't even have to push next page. So now we and our children are just scrolling all day. And that is a very unpredictable psychosocial environment. And then one more thing, I got to attribute this to some of my favorite scholars and thinkers out there, particularly Zach Stein, who I have a sense that probably you would be familiar with, education cog psych researcher. There are theorists out there who are saying, look, if this scrolling has hacked our attention, then AI and all of the bots involved in our lives might be hacking our attachment. So what are we meant to do in this very unpredictable world? So there's a part of me that deeply understands why we are not connecting toward each other, why we have difficulty seeing the other, that other people matter. And I want to attribute that to Chris Peterson, a titan in positive psychology and well-being sciences. And may he very much rest in peace in a way that his scholarship has led the charge for so many of us. That in this very unpredictable world, how do we create safety and co-regulation for all of us, especially since so many of us are exhausted and we know why?
Once again, many threads that I'm very curious about, but I wanted to just bring you in, Nigel, if that's okay. We introduced this idea now of trauma, regulation, co-regulation, even attachment, and the way that these internal processes are being influenced by technology and culture and society. And Nigel, I know you've done a lot of work in these spaces, in relation to those things. So I wonder, Nigel, could you give us some definitions of some of these things and just help position us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Trauma as a psychological feature, it's really identified in the mid-1980s as PTSD in response to servicemen returning from the Vietnam War, largely. And so, for the first time in human history, we had a name for something that really disrupted who and what we experience. And I'm really kind of interested, Tom, in kind of picking up a lot of this idea of predictability. Carl Friston's been very influential in recent years around free energy principle and recognizing how the brain moves exactly in the way you're describing towards predictability. And so what's so core to healthy psychology is what Anthony Bateman and Peter Fonagy describe as epistemic trust. This deeply embodied trust that comes from systematic predictability between an infant and an adult, which about half of the adult population in generous assessment possess. So, what you'd be seeing, no doubt, in a lot of the work you do, are children whose predictive mechanisms are around distrust, are around kind of fear, and this is what we were kind of touching on, and what Scott had also pointed to, this kind of idea that people are predicting threat, that they're predicting being let down, that they're predicting, and we're biologically programmed to have so much kind of survival response that it's so easy for that to become a dominant feature. And if this is what's happening in childhood, it's constant kind of orientation towards threat, constant orientation towards distrust. What do we do to correct that and orient towards this more kind of coherent idea of participation and being held and supported by the world around us?
I have devoted my career, and so have you, to psychoeducation. And I don't love that word. So instead of saying psychoeducation, I like telling students, young people, we're going to teach you about yourself. We're going to give you some ideas to consider how you may respond to stress, because school is stress. School is one speed bump after another, and that's for a high-flying student. So I think a lot about students who have only experienced speed bumps in their daily school life. Their stress overload is their way of interacting in the world. And I love teaching students big words like catastrophizing. And I've done that with 9-year-olds, even starting back in New York. This idea, and this comes from the resilience literature for children, that if we can begin to teach children every day, you and we catastrophize. That's when our brain turns on and we start thinking to ourselves, why did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do that? And then an hour later, you're still thinking to yourself, why did I do that? That is natural. It is a normal part of every single one of us. And I've seen children who have really struggled to manage themselves, and I don't love that language, but it's a language that a lot of teachers will say. But I see a lot of light bulbs go on when children and teenagers start learning some of this stuff, and they start thinking, oh, I'm not a failure. I'm just doing something that I didn't know. But that notion of catastrophizing and understanding your stress response, I certainly tell many, many teachers out there, if you expect your classroom to be smooth, then they're probably not learning. Like, we expect a little escalation. We expect when students are not sure how to manage themselves, when they feel that overload, that their friends are watching, the teacher has expectations, I'm supposed to be doing this learning progression, that we want to give them as many self-knowledge supports so they can learn to trust their body and trust their impulses and trust the reactions they may have to stress. But I want to lift this back up to Scott's earlier question around democracy and community. And I bet, like you, I am following research, particularly by Penderson and colleagues, that are looking at things like political conservatives have an increased negativity bias, increased attention to reactivity. Some studies, and I'm not going to say this is the truth, research is not the truth. As a researcher and social scientist, I'm always making suggestions. But the suggestion is it could be that political conservatives and people who absolutely hold on to authoritarian values may have enlarged amygdalas, that they may have a deeper sense that threat is omnipresent and that they must be alert. And what you and I both can then make a bit of a judgment, a bit of a predicted finding, that if you are mobilizing your resources toward protection, defense, and threat, then you probably don't have much left in the tank for community, considering curiosity for the other and opening your heart with a little unconditional positive regard for those who may not be able to make clear choices of their own.
That's such a powerful point you're making there, Tom. That with the enlarged amygdala is also relatively concurrent with a contracted hippocampus.
Yes.
So not only are you alert to threat stimulus, but your capacity to encode memory is reduced. So you're getting locked in these kind of patterns of response in the present moment.
I got to add the locked into it. I mean, I'm talking about myself here too. Like this is, I get into locked in patterns of conflict and locked in patterns of defense when I feel a sense that my own psychological safety may not be present if I'm in a room with somebody who I felt like we were getting along and we were just connecting around the footy. It was fine. And then they drop something into the room that instantly puts up my amygdala that says, oh, we may not have the same values toward equity. We may not have the same values right now to treat others as we want to be treated. So that means that as an actor for social justice, that I will have to watch my own actions. I have to take care of myself because I have a tendency, in the safety of this room with you, I will admit, that when faced with authoritarian values in the room, I myself can't help but arc myself up and get a little louder and try to sort of argue someone back to their point. And it's taken me many, many years to try and convince myself, and I'm still not convinced really authentically, which is why I'm participating in this conversation with you today, that, you can't argue with rationality somebody who has irrationally positioned themselves in the world. So what do? I think that's one of our big topics, not just for today, but for our work out there.
One of the things that we've done quite a bit of work on is this idea of collaboration, conflict, and collusion. That Liotti talks about collaboration as a superordinate motivational system in humans that stabilizes other organizing systems, such as the attachment system, but that we're not very good at stabilizing collaboration. What we tend to do is contract back, as you're describing there, that experience in the room of someone being threatening and being, kind of argumentative, almost invokes in us an equal and opposite force. And there's something in, kind of a skill set that we don't yet really possess around being able to hold a collaborative frame. It's such an interesting kind of area for me.
I think a lot around the purpose of education. And I like giving keynotes on this, the purpose of education. When I was a teacher, I thought, oh, yes, when I was a literacy teacher with 11-year-olds, the fourth lesson we taught every single September in the Northern Hemisphere, we taught the difference between fact and opinion. And I remember being a teacher and being like, this is a fact, this is an opinion. Everybody code with your highlighter, the facts and the opinions. And everyone in my class would always get a good grade on that assignment. And we keep doing it. And it became so like rote in my head as a teacher. I was like, oh, well, we have to do this. I can't stop thinking around those lessons now. And in the specters around the world, where it turns out that the literacy for the future was maybe the difference between understanding fact versus propaganda opinion. And that is something in the infinite scroll we're all struggling with our own siloed news feeds, et cetera. But I'd also suggest that the point of learning, the way I now think of it, is to have students, many of them made vulnerable by stress and adverse childhood experiences by no fault of their own. And I think it's also important for me to say, we never blame parents and carers. We never blame community for the vulnerabilities that children are contending with, because we take a systemic approach. And my social workers out there will certainly like that I'm about to say the word Brothenbrenner. And if you don't know what that is, look it up, especially if you're a teacher, because a systemic approach reminds us that the student, the person, the child, the individual in front of you is embedded within cultural systems, value systems, community systems. In all of that sway, my goal for education, particularly for students who are vulnerable, is that they learn to like themselves, that they learn to trust learning and trust the classroom as a way to understand their own journey as a human being. And so the first port of call in trauma-informed education is to build trust, whether that's trust in the physical body itself, like we can move and learn at the same time, we can regulate. We have all these strategies we like sharing with schools to help children regulate, particularly when they need to move and learn at the same time. But then also from an adult standpoint, what can adults do to create classrooms that are both safe haven and secure base? If you know the circle of security theory of relationships, I've just made you smile. But this idea that an adult can habit these different kinds of relational identities to prove to the child that this is the place where you can put the phone down and you can lean in and work with others. And the voice when working with others, I think that's the empowered first step toward the democratic actor.
I guess what I'm hearing is that all of us are born with these nervous systems, these brains that operate in a certain kind of way. And there's a process that can be triggered of trauma, which is, forgive me, feel free to jump in if I'm getting the definition wrong, but trauma can lead to a threat response in which I'm contracting away from relationship and I'm orienting towards threat. And you also mentioned stress, which, that stress can similarly kind of orient us towards stress. It can be difficult to navigate. But that there's these other features of our systems as well. There is a capacity to co-regulate. There is a capacity, Nigel, as you're saying, to collaborate. And that when we're operating together in those kinds of ways, that actually that helps our nervous system operate in a more optimal fashion. I guess what I'm also hearing is it sounds like, our technological landscape at the moment of the endless scroll and these other features is kind of exploiting some of these, the stress response, potentially trauma or trauma avoidance or something like that. And that might be then rippling out at a political level into the way we vote, the way we think about the other. And I guess I'm kind of thinking of that idea of like the fractal, like there's a snowflake. If you zoom into the snowflake at the small level, it's got a certain pattern. And if you zoom out, it's got a kind of a similar pattern at a different scale. So I guess I'm kind of reflecting on that as you're talking, like, is it possible that these systems of trauma and stress, exploited by our technological landscape at the moment are rippling out and kind of having an impact on our politics? So I just wanted to kind of see if I'm tracking. Am I kind of following? Are there other bits that you would want to kind of round out that I've kind of missed?
Yeah, well, I'm with you, Jordan. I care a lot about fractals. I care a lot about geometries. I like fourth dimensional spaces. It's a breadcrumb if you choose to accept that. I care a lot about understanding both the cell all the way up to the system. And that's something that trauma-informed and well-being sciences have certainly informed my own research and my own leadership within sectors. I definitely want to just say a couple more words about trauma to kind of ground us, because it's such an important concept that often we know, and this is probably, well, I know this is going to be the most serious thing I'm going to say today. So I just want to give everybody a chance to connect to their bodies and center themselves if this is going to resonate for you and maybe your family history. That in Australia, one of the persistent concerns that we must contend with together and proactively support is the concern of family violence and violence to women. And we know that there is not enough systemic support to mitigate the longstanding impacts of family violence and intergenerational family violence. That said, I just want to take a breath and talk about what it means to the developing infant who may be carried to term by someone experiencing violence. That there are many concerns around nurturing and connection. And as Nigel has well articulated, some of those early bonds of attachment. But to answer your question, Jordan, yes, you are absolutely in the right track in my book. That when I think around research that suggests infants carried to term in violence, in someone experiencing violence, that unpredictability, that unpredictable escalation, that can dysregulate an infant's heart rate. So by the time that the little one is in school, that little heart may be working overtime. So this is an important finding from studies that we track. My guess is that your resting heart rate, you and listeners out there, might be between 60 and 90 beats per minute. If you're wearing a wearable, I welcome you to check it. And I hope while you're listening to this, your heart rate is between 60 and 90 beats per minute. If not, please proactively get support you need. But I would also suggest that when we've supported children and young people in out-of-home care and for science and health class, we'll kind of teach them how to take their heart rate. 13-year-old who is in out-of-home care provision, the resting heart rate might be 130 beats per minute, and that's the teenager looking cool. So if the teenager hears gossip about them, or they didn't like a look from their teacher, or somebody's making fun of them, they go from 130, 150 in 2 hot seconds, and they've lost control of their own conscious thinking and their own body's responses. So I definitely take a macro view, which I've taken some time to share with you today. But if you're an everyday education professional, if you're a teacher just trying to do your best to create cultures of belonging and climates for learning and culturally responsive, neurodiversity affirming places, that you would be thinking, you know what? How am I supposed to do this in the granularity of my everyday practice? And to me, it does start by attending to students who go from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds and to teach them these strategies around regulation and trust. And that, in fact, can create a classroom that itself is co-regulating. And my goal, of course, I know I share this goal with you, is that we're raising a new generation that can understand their place in a technological world that we could never have dreamed of, that they can figure out how to support each other and use this technology in enormously important ways for them.
I'd love, in a moment, Scott, to have you help us connect the dots back to politics. But just before we do so, I've heard, Nigel, you mention this idea of skills and collaboration. And Tom, you mentioned this idea of skills. It sounds, so even as it sounds like there's these adversity trends where certain aspects of our neurobiology are kind of being amplified and having negative impacts potentially on our democracies and our worlds. It also sounds like there's a hopeful story too, that like by learning about this neurobiology, which Nigel, it sounds like it's only recent decades that we've got the level of granularity around these systems, that actually maybe there's a positive future. Like there's so many negative visions at the moment, that we can see out there about the way things could go and these negative trends. But I guess I'm sensing that there's a positive vision, Tom, that you have, that's like, maybe if we learn this, we learn these skills, we learn these practices, and learn these aspects of ourselves and ways of being together. So it does sound like it's not just individual, it's about co-regulation, it's doing this together. That actually something very different, a very different future in terms of our flourishing and well-being as individuals for the next generation, but also maybe even that might ripple positively into our politics. Like, what would it be if we could really collaborate across political boundaries and feel safe, whether, no matter how we identify politically together? So yeah, I'm curious, Tom, if you could share a little around this idea of what's the positive vision that you have.
We are seeing enormously cool outcomes in schools that are taking very seriously this proactive journey toward trauma-informed, strengths-based education. That part of this is helping schools understand that there are so many things we can do to help children meet their physical, emotional, and cognitive needs for learning. Yes, that echoes Maslow's and other developmental hierarchies. We think a lot around cultural safety, particularly within the Australian context. I'm going to only speak within my own national context. I know we do work around the world, and that's very important, but today I'll focus on Australia. That to meet your cultural needs, to meet one's spiritual needs, I'll define that as connecting to something greater than yourself. That we're seeing an entire generation of Australian educators understand that this is possible. I also have the privilege of working with departments of education who are placing well-being literacies right next to, side by side, integrated with literacies for learning. When I look at the national standards that could have never existed when I was becoming a teacher years ago, that there are many, many educational peak bodies and systems saying well-being for learning, learning for well-being. It's an important skill that we have not attended to enough. And my team and I are absolutely thinking a lot around leadership models and community models. And I definitely want to drop something down before I think I hand it to our other panelists, Nigel and Scott too, that I want to attribute this to Jack Gregg, who is a doctoral student with us and a leader at Berry Street, who's developed the SEED model as a method to support students, empower student voice, empower teacher contribution. And SEED stands for safety, engagement, empathy, and dialogue. And that is both an aim, but a method that to create the psychological and physical safety, we have to focus on that co-regulatory safety, safe within our bodies to even trust our own responses. Everybody around me in my sector is kind of obsessed with student engagement. How do we get them out of bed? How do we get them to school? How do we address school can't? How do we be able to prove to students that we're here for them? And then, of course, to Scott's point earlier, one of our goals is empathy for the other, empathy for the self-compassion. And that can only occur through dialogue, which I hope that we're modeling for people today. But Scott and Nigel, I also want to ask, how do you respond to those things?
Well, so many interesting angles. To pull the camera back all the way up high and look at the really big picture of how trauma, generally defined and societally defined, has shaped the world in which we live, and how it can be used in a positive way, perhaps to build the next stage of our evolutionary process at a political level. So you may or may not agree with this, but a lot of people believe that, with lots of flexibility built in, that history in the last in the industrial age has kind of come in 80-year cycles. And, you can look that up, like you can look up all those names that Tom mentioned. And we are right now at the end of the most recent 80-year cycle. And we're just on the cusp of beginning the next 80-year cycle. if we look at the current 80-year cycle, you can basically date it back to the end of the Second World War, which came about on the heels of the largest possible amount of human trauma that could be experienced collectively at any given time. And on the basis of that, in part, the people that created the international order in which we still live used that trauma to say this must never happen again. Not just the Holocaust, but the global emergence of fascism, a world war that killed 100 million people or more. I don't remember exact numbers, but we know how bad it was. Ended in nuclear carnage, the only time nuclear weapons have ever been used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This must never happen again. We have to figure out a way to prevent this. We need to have an institution called the United Nations that will bring everybody together instead of everybody fighting each other. We need to have an international legal order where everybody acts according to the same rules and regulations that everybody agrees to. And the list goes on. But of course, they could have gone down a further route, which would have been world citizenship. But they stopped way before that point and decided, oh no, we have to base it on nation states and all of the things that brought nation states into existence: language, previous wars, ethnicity, religion, the region in which they existed geographically, the experience with colonialism, etc. That led to the system that we have today. It's done many great things. It's resolved or assisted in resolving a lot of trauma. It has placed education at the center of a normal functioning, more and more prosperous society. And it's played a fundamental role. So the first question I have for you, Tom, and I'll ask quickly three. How do we use the trauma that we understand now, 80 years later, as a driving force in building the next model of what comes next after this current cycle comes to an end? How can we use what we've learned about trauma and addressing it and resolving it to build something that truly is evolutionary in scope vis-a-vis previous incarnations of this 80-year cycle? And then secondly, and relatedly, it's very important to understand and point out that every single authoritarian regime, autocratic regime, dictatorial regime, of which there are approximately 79 in the world today, where the majority of the human race is now living under an autocratic regime of various levels of intensity, and there are many aspiring authoritarian regimes. One common feature that they all share is their utter disdain for higher education and education generally. And you see budget cuts, you see attempts in some countries to almost eradicate entire structures of education in the interests of preventing larger segments of the population from expanding their minds and learning more and understanding. And there's a clear link between voting patterns and educational levels in certain countries. Not all, and it's not black and white entirely, but there is a link between the level of education that people have had access to and how they tend to view the world, and therefore how they vote. So how do we deal with that question? And then finally, you mentioned AI. How do you see AI playing itself out in the world of trauma? Is it going to create more trauma? Or is it going to resolve our trauma? Or is it going to take the place of our trauma? What's it going to do? I mean, you see people around the world now by huge numbers who are closer to their AI machine than they are to fellow humans. I mean, that's just one element of it. But the ability to not have to work anymore or not be needed anymore as an employee, as a worker in the economic system in which you live, what's that going to do to people's state of being and mental health and trauma? And the list is endless. So just those three kind of general points: the 80-year cycle, AI, and the undercutting of education by the right wing.
Just those three in the time we have, Scott. I'm here for the big questions. I'm going to start with AI. I think a lot about AI as both a university academic, AI is a complicated thing. I definitely need to say there are very good things about AI. This is important to state in a conversation dialogue like this. For instance, some of my colleagues in China are working on therapeutic coaching because in some countries, there are not enough culturally responsive, culturally informed psychological professionals, psychologists. And so there are many, many, many young people that we work with who do not feel like they have literally a lifeline or a voice of unconditional positive regard for them to feel like they can reach out for support. And there is enormously important and promising evidence that for the youth of today, that many of them will feel safe to seek out supports through an AI tool. So that's important. And I have some grad students who are working on projects involving culturally responsive and trauma-informed AI tools. So that's important. And frankly, as a Luddite, I resist it all, but I take on really smart grad students who want to work on this toward equity in responsible ways. Okay, that's important. Let's put that aside. I also can suggest that we're worried. I mentioned earlier, based on some of the scholarship arising, that AI is truly hacking attachment to the point that some of us have little children who were given toys this Christmas, that have the ability to respond to children in ways that are responsive and available to them. And that would start replacing some of the real in-person relationship formation and skills and tools and including eye contact and conversational distance and mirroring emotions. Okay, yes, we're concerned about that. So it's both an opportunity and a threat. That's a serious thing. So let's just say that's one answer. I also think a lot around your 80-year cycle. And when I think around my own childhood and my own childhood in the late 70s and thinking around myself as a growing person, one way around world democracies and navigating through the noise, I think a lot about the philosopher Jean Baudrillard and the notion of the simulacra, where the representation of an idea becomes more real than the actual object itself. It was always given in schools. They always say, like Las Vegas, like the idea that we have around the world of Las Vegas is more real to us than the physicality of being in that place. The images are more real than that which we somatically feel or that authentically we experience in the real world. So all of the simulacra that is surrounding us and our ideas and our vision, how do we help people navigate through the simulacra, the quote, fake news? And I can't help it. I doom scroll every morning. I know it's not good for my well-being. But just this morning, I was listening to people talk about how in authoritarian speak, there are specific cues, and I know, Nigel, this is something that you study very deeply around cult leadership, that the cues are to block the thinking, that the cues that the leader says is to stop the curiosity and the thinking for oneself. And that notion of fake news, or the other kind of thing we heard a lot during COVID times was, oh, I have questions about the evidence, and then the thinking stops. So Scott, one answer I have for you is, how do we find access points for a variety of different people in a variety of different ways? That is an infinite task. It is a daunting task. But one way that I feel and hope that people are waking up is it's taken gas prices around the world to wake people up that maybe they're living in some kind of political simulacra, that everything they've been told by certain news channels is not the truth. And because pocketbook seems to be the most important thing to some, in terms of, whoa, that came out not correct. I understand that many people need sustenance to live. What I'm saying is there are people who are trapped in their own simulacras, not embodying the reality around them, that it was only when the gas prices went and come down that they started realizing, oh, maybe everything I'm being taught in my news cycle isn't helping me every day in my life. So in this situation, gas prices became this access point. Okay, fine. I'm kind of deeply unhappy that it's taken this long for some people to wake up, but I'll take the waking up. But I wonder so much of the time around, how do people gain access to new ideas? What is it that draws some people forward, and what other ideas draw other people forward? And that's why I'm so attracted to the dialogue that you all keep nurturing through this podcast, because when I listen to you, what you're doing is dropping down such interesting access points for different people with different orientations. And frankly, it's exhausting. It's compassion fatigue, but I see no other choice. Like, that's why I keep getting up every day to do this work. And my entry point is to reach educators and education leaders to say, we care about learning. We care about learning progression. There's a lot of other stuff. Yeah, you can believe there are some teachers that I work with who initially do not believe that learning and well-being can be the same pursuit. Some teachers will say, I'm here to teach science. Don't tell me how to regulate bodies, and I want it to be here for the kids that want to learn. So then I think, oh, okay, well, you're not ready to teach the next generation yet, but I will meet you where you're at. I'll talk about learning progression. We'll talk about high expectations for learning achievement. And to help everybody move forward, I've got to figure out those access points. But I certainly want to throw it over to you all as well. Like, in your own work, like, what access points have really offered promising pathways toward making your way through to a democratic mindset?
One of the things that we're trying to do in helping to understand the relationship between psychology and political behaviour is a kind of an understanding of the way that the human mind operates and is organised. So, we begin as sensate creatures, at birth, just after birth, the sensations are all that an infant has access to. And then affect comes on board through relationship, but at a very raw, kind of biologically based, embodied kind of way. And then this unique evolutionary mechanism kicks in with humans, which is this sort of symbolic organisation of mind, which may be kind of engaged by other animal species as well, but we've got this remarkable capacity to abstract this symbolic organisation, which then develops into cognition and further abstracted symbolic representation. But it's this symbolic layer that's so poorly articulated in psychology. Carl Jung looks at it, object relations therapists look at it, but it's so fundamental to the organisation of affect and sensation beneath it, and the infusion of thoughts and concepts and reasoning above it in kind of developmental terms. They're not kind of like a stepladder of processes, but they're a kind of a set of feedback loops that become increasingly oriented towards a top-down view. But it's this symbolic organisation, and this is what great cult leaders know. This is what great family violence perpetrators know. This is what great marketers know, politicians. When you start interfering with the symbolic representation of mind, this part of the mind that once, not too far away ago in our history, symbolically, it was a really good idea to stab your firstborn through the heart to make sure that the harvest occurs or that the sun rises the next day. There's this incredibly compelling symbolic representation that influences above and below. And good cult leaders know this. Good marketers know this. Good politicians know. You're not trying to reason with people. You're trying to create a symbolic representation that moves and drives them, creates fear, creates anger, creates need and want. And it's part of our education is helping people understand the power and the nature of our mind, which is not what psychology is looking at right now. And I'm just so refreshed, Tom, to hear you talk about systemic thinking and Bronfenbrenner and Vygotsky and these kind of ideas of the way that influence in the broader world. it works for family violence, it works for institutional abuse, that we're really starting to look a little differently at the way the human mind works, because at the moment psychology has kind of parked itself in the pathology and medical model, where the problems are all about the individual and failings of the individual. And so we're losing this huge opportunity to educate the population about the strengths of these other features of mind that you're talking to from an educational perspective.
Nigel, that really helps me understand a few things. Thank you. It's a bit of a mic drop moment for my own vista, because I was thinking, okay, the hyper age of information, as we were saying, the simulacra of the representation at all angles, on all screens, all the time. You're saying that these symbols, some of them have been with us for a very, very, very long time. They arise in the world's great faith traditions. They arise across time and across continent. And then what makes this age particularly complex is, I think, the speed of the scroll and the speed of life and the speed of economic compression. And all of those things are getting in the way of us even understanding what the symbol is, let alone how to interpret that symbol in healthy ways. Am I understanding that right?
I mean, we know this from, kind of semiotics. We know that these symbols are themselves way more pervasive than reason and logic. And that's been a kind of a battle of our species. When we get these periods, these 200-year periods of stabilization, where we link together through ideals, such as the Roman Republic, such as the Athenian democracy, such as the Constitution of the United States as it starts, these periods where we link through ideal, we're doing something very different to when the most of the time where we're linking through these symbols of nation and creed and everything else that we'll kill for.
And that's what the American right has done so well at avatar level, is that for the last 10 years, or more, beginning with in the 80s, that the unifying symbols between media, politicians, the money, and the leadership were aligned. And they were aligned in such ideological ways that the symbols became unbreakable as a semiotic system. And now people are in that system.
Linking it also to Christianity, a distorted
Yes.
view of Christianity
Sure.
to amplify and
Power.
to create a millennial
Yes.
symbolic kind of register.
So the question is, as a new migrant to Australia, I keep saying I'm new, but I'm not that. I've been an Australian for about 15 years now, but that's new, considering that we are proud to be on land of the longest continuous cultures in the world, our First Nations cultures, that I often wonder to myself, well, then, if we are in Australia and we are considering democracy, what are some of the protective factors that we have, and what do we need to be aware of? So as a new migrant, I think of two things that I think are both protective factors, but things we must be aware of. But I certainly want to ask you, as people who have lived here longer than I have. I think of, as a new person here, the idea of required voting. Compulsory voting is a very important thing to our democracy. When the dialogue, certainly in the United States, is to reach those who may be sitting on their couch to get up and vote. If people can just vote the way that they are predicted to, democracy might have a better shot. Okay, that's a thing. The other thing that I learned very quickly is the idea of Australian mateship. That it's the mateship that both is a protective factor, but also could quickly turn into values of domination if the group decides that we're going to help each other move toward either helping or not helping. But I'd love for you three to help deconstruct what I've just said, to give me some insight around those things.
Okay, so first of all, what you said about compulsory voting is absolutely true. It's a huge blessing in disguise. 99% of the population never thinks about it. They take it for granted. It's just, the people that do think about it probably try to avoid it. But the ones that benefit from it most, which is the majority, don't sing out its positive elements enough, in my humble opinion. I think there should be global mandatory voting on various matters at the global level, at the planetary level, and they can take a lot of guidance from here. One of the outcomes of compulsory voting almost always is a tendency towards moderation, right? And, I might be on the left side of the political spectrum. As a matter of fact, I am. And maybe even in the green direction. Maybe I am. But I know by being a part of a democratic system, I am not always going to win. That's a fundamental prerequisite for democracy to work. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. Sometimes it's yin, sometimes it's yang. But you have to accept that to be an active player within a democratic system in which you are required to participate, it's a civil duty to be part of the structures which govern you. That is a beautiful concept. By contrast, the country where both Tom and I were born, or not born, but were raised, the United States, is almost on the other end of the spectrum. They do whatever they possibly can to prevent the largest number of people from voting. So the simple, here you're basically automatically registered. I mean, you have to do one quick step. It takes 5 seconds and you're registered. It's a process, an arduous one in the United States that you have to undertake actively yourself at the age of 18. Whereas they could make it very simple. They could say every time you get your driver's license, you are automatically registered to vote. When you get a social security number, you're automatically registered to vote. And then, add these layers of complexity, which they're doing right now with the redistricting processes in so many different states and gerrymandering everything, undermining democracy with each subsequent step. And there's countless other things. So as a result of compulsory voting here, you do have a tendency to move politics to the middle, and it can be center right or center left. We are now facing a very different sort of complex series of circumstances, which we have largely avoided in the past few decades compared to other countries like Hungary or the United States, Argentina, a range of others that have gone from center left politics generally, strong, reasonable social democracy into like hard right governance. Where the emergence of one political party in particular here is gaining traction like never before. And in a recent election, they actually even got a seat in the lower houses of parliament, which has never happened before. And so we need to ask not only will the center hold, so to speak, will the compulsory voting system prevent the emergence of an extreme right government or even a coalition of right-wing governments in the future, or will it not hold? And, we need to discuss the particular elements of that down the road, maybe in another podcast, another time, but this is something to bear in mind. And the way in which they are using the issue of migration, which is very common, it's happening in the UK right now with, the Reform Party. It's totally happening in the United States. The United States takes almost no refugees anymore, except for white South Africans. In a world where there are human rights abuses in scores of countries where millions of legitimate refugees need asylum and they will not get it because of this new policy of the Trump administration. That's just one example of many. Australia has benefited only from the migration waves that we have had as a country, which was not something that was envisaged at the beginning. And I think it's really important to point that out. The very first policy ever adopted by the Federation of Australia in 1901 was the White Australia policy. That was the number one thing. That was the basis upon which this country was formulated as it came out of colonialism. But look at what we've done to transcend that, Look at how the relationship, and it's as far from perfect as could be imagined, but the relationship between Indigenous people here now and the government of the early 1900s. There's countless problems in the First Nations world in this country, of course, but the recognition, the flying of the flag over public buildings, the way in which public meetings are started, where there's always mention of the land on which the meeting is taking place, and all sorts of social programs, so on and so forth. There has been progress, and there has been a recognition of the wrongs that have been done. There has been a degree of atonement. There's been a recognition that's really, really important to remember. And the way in which migration has positively changed Australia over the last century, particularly over the last half century, has been staggering, with barely a peep of opposition. It was largely supported by left and right for different reasons, maybe, but it was largely embraced. This is going to make our country stronger. It's going to make it more wealthy, first and foremost. It's the compassionate right thing to do. And it's going to become more interesting. And you even hear right-wing politicians now who are not so right-wing that they're anti-migration, and they speak about it as, we wouldn't have that great cup of coffee in the morning if it wasn't for those migrants. They speak of it like that, which is a rather simplified version. But I think by and large, when you ask almost anybody here, they have positive stories to tell about migration. But what needs to be fought against, of course, is the use of the term mass migration by right-wing political parties here to create fear in society, get people to let their unresolved traumas guide their behavior and their worldviews and say, yes, we have too many. We need to keep them out. We mustn't have any more. And that's, something, again, we hope that the current system will allow itself to play out, that doesn't happen, but it's very much of a danger. And Australia is really in a certain crossroads moment politically now, whereas in the past you could just almost rely on the fact that the system would always hold in the center. And given cost of living pressures now for a lot of people, the cost of housing, it's very easy to try to put the blame on someone else. And they know the game plan, they know the blueprint, and they're just doing what all these other countries have done. So let's hope that we can learn from other countries and also realize, the thing that most people that would tend to vote extreme right don't realize is that it fails. Wherever it has been tried or attempted, it always fails. It's just a matter of time and how much damage is done in the process. And so let's avoid the failure, and let's just look at the real facts of the situation and try to push things, in a direction that is a true reflection of these basic underlying Australian values that immigrants like me and Tom here in this meeting probably embrace more than average Australians do because they were new to us when we were introduced to them, like basic egalitarianism, like the fair play ideal, the tall poppy syndrome, all of these things have, as their basis, really positive ways of, viewing society and your position in it. So just let me say that. And then finally, the important point I want to make about exposure. So much of life and how you view other people comes about based upon how much exposure you have had to those other people. How many Africans have you been exposed to? How many, indigenous people have you met? How many Asians have you hung out with? How many Brazilians have you hung out with? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if I was to build a new system, a new political system, one of the key elements I would put in it would be a minimum, fully paid for by the state, a minimum 2-year living overseas experience by every single high school student in the country, where you learn a language, you immerse yourself in the culture of some totally different place, you understand that culture, you become part of that culture, and then you can either stay there or you can come back, whatever you want to do. But it's that exposure. If you go live in a place, it's impossible for you to hate the people of that place, because you will find, even if you've never been there before, that the vast majority of the people you encounter are absolutely great people. It's a tiny segment of society who are truly unpalatable. Most people, most places are just like you. They want exactly the same thing that you want. It's not some other weird alien sort of way of being. They want essentially the basics of life like you do. They want peace, they want quiet, they want security, they want love, they want harmony, they want unity, they want to have a full belly, they want to love their children and grow old in a healthy way. That's pretty much the basic human urge. And when you know it firsthand, when you've lived there and been there with the people, it's very hard to have your worldview driven by hatred of the so-called other.
I just want to add to what Scott said, because Scott is painting a very important picture of a lighthouse future. Scott, you just said that you want every single person in our country to experience living abroad, to have exposure to other people. I want to add to that, having become a citizen in a way that I never thought. Like, I lived in America. I had no intention of ever leaving America to live in a different country. So when my partner and I moved here and we went through all the steps toward permanent residency, and then we went through all of the steps to become citizens, it wasn't until we were on that stage at Richmond Town Hall, if you know Victoria, you know Richmond, where I was standing there with other migrants and we were becoming citizens. And I thought to myself, wow, we worked for this. We earned this. We went through 800 steps. I want every single person to go through this as an adult, to earn your citizenship free, and to have that moment where you realize our country is not perfect. There's so much work we need to do, but I'm standing here as an adult making a conscious choice. In the same way, Scott, you're talking about making the conscious choice to vote. So I want to throw that in the bucket for the utopia.
So I might share a little bit. I think, Nigel, you'll be able to flesh out some of the bits that I share with a bit more nuance. But I guess for me, as we're having this conversation and thinking about the state of democracy around the world, but also, I guess, my brighter future, having a background as a school teacher, now studying psychology, and, also working in human rights with Scott, years ago, all these intersections are so close to my heart. And I guess the particular thing that I'm passionate about, I mentioned this to you, Tom, one time we had a chat, was this idea that the way that we're conceiving of education as the norm at the moment is just one way of doing it. And there's many, many different ways of doing it. So Scott, your example of 2 years abroad, like, that's just one example of many different things that we could do to better prepare all of us to be world citizens. It's this growing journey for all of us. One of the examples I like to go back to that just helped me kind of break out of this this fog that was like, this is the way it is and the way it has to be, was learning about Nalanda University. So this was a Indo-Tibetan Buddhist university that several hundred years ago, it was the biggest learning institution in the world. So at a certain point in history, that was like the direction that we were going. And not to sort of valorize that religiously, but just in terms of the practices, wisdom and compassion cultivation, their kind of system of cultivating wisdom and compassion is so sophisticated. It's extraordinary. So to think that there was such an emphasis on embodying those qualities is really inspiring to me. And sadly, the university got burnt down, like there was an invading army and so on. But I guess that's what excites me, is this idea of, what if we take the best of what we know from psychology as well as ancient wisdom traditions, and we create a curriculum that really helps us optimize our minds, our hearts, our souls, our bodies. Like, that would be amazing. And then combine that with, a state-of-the-art education in politics and power and this sense of fraternity with the whole human species. I think that if we have the capacity now to do that like never before. And so I kind of like the metaphor of Hogwarts, like of this sort of mythical mystery school of transformation. I think that, it's really nice, Tom, to hear you're so on the pulse of the leading edge of this in education system. It's so amazing to hear the way that well-being and learning and teaching is becoming, it sounds, more interwoven and seen as being one thing. So anyway, so that's some of my vision. But yeah, Nigel, I'd love to throw to you, because I know you can, especially around this the psychological side of it, you can add a lot of granularity to this idea of optimization of mind.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem that we have at the moment is that the world that we're living in is supported by institutions that are based on fairly ancient organizational principles like power and control. So when we start to optimize and we start to get people to trust, and we get people to kind of hold their intergenerational traumas, and we do that in a kind of confined space. I do it in this clinic room, and you can create this sort of bubble of trust and security here, but you're sending people out into structures that are not that. We're sending people out into structures that are not refined, that are not conducive to safety and trust. They're conducive to competition and to power over, and it's kind of recognizing that intersection point between what we want ideally and what we're currently living in. Ilya Prigogine kind of won a Nobel Prize for his kind of work on dissipative systems and chaos theory. And what he talks about in a way similar to what Thomas Kuhn talks about in The End of a Paradigm, where the outliers are becoming more and more frequent and the centre doesn't hold. What Prigogine talks about is that rather than everything necessarily just dissipating and collapsing, that there's an organising principle that occurs, that something happens to reorganise. And I think that's what we're kind of talking about at the moment, is the need for some kind of meta-organising principle to reshape the world that we're trying to take people into, because fixing people at the individual level and at the small group level, that is feeding into what people are expecting of the world, and the reduction in toleration. I have a very different experience of migration. I was 3 years old when my parents migrated from Wales, and they were getting away from a continent that had been ravaged by the Second World War, and getting away from their developmental trauma. What a great idea, go 12,000 miles away in a completely different culture and everything will be fine. And it wasn't fine. We went to Gippsland, and I was 3, but most of my cousins, because a few of my uncles came as well, my cousins were a lot older. They got involved in high school culture or later primary school culture. Their Welsh accents disappeared within a few months. And they all speak like Aussies now. They're, really, really adapted to this kind of cultural norming in the country, because there was nothing else to hold us. There was nothing to integrate. There were all these assumptions about mateship and camaraderie and that kind of thing, but it wasn't really very well articulated or defined. You kind of felt into it rather than thought your way into it. So I think there's something that's really, really kind of needed at the meta level, and I think there's something about a psychology of reflectiveness, a psychology of awareness, a psychology that understands how a body emerges not just from its own biology, but from within the systems and the intergenerational systems that hold it, and just bringing this awareness into structure and system as a way of really placing pressure on the current system to transform, because the current system doesn't hold wellness. It's not oriented to wellness, would be the way I would say it. It's one of the tensions between something like psychology as it's practiced today and education. Psychology should be something about educating, like social psychology, educating people around what healthy minds are in a healthy context.
Tom, I'd love to hear your reflections on that. Are there threads of that particularly resonate, or that you kind of would love to share a sort of different view on?
I do not have a different view, because I certainly want to validate Nigel's contentions. And it's the seeking toward new practice that is always what gets me up in the morning. Like frequently, maybe you do too, when we work with other professionals, they say, "Oh, I can't learn one more thing. Like, can I just have more time for consolidation? Can we just like stop the clock a little bit? And can I just get this first practice down before the next? And are you just telling me to do another pony on the carousel of change?" And that's when I smile again with a bit of unconditional positive regard and say, "Oh no, we do need to keep learning. We have to keep integrating this new knowledge. We have to choose to move forward through learning. That's what we're doing here. That's what our children deserve. That's what we absolutely owe them." And so it's important, again, think a lot about access points. And for us, I think it's fun to just be in your presence today to feel that access point of continuous learning.
Thank you, Tom. It's been so beautiful to have this conversation, and it feels like it's been a really broad-reaching conversation. At times I've been like sort of almost scraping to keep up with some of the threads, because each of you is such incredible professionals in each of your areas, and there's just so many ways that these two topics of the inner world and then the world of systems, the way that they intersect. Now, Tom, if it's cool with you, we might turn over to our round of some rapid fire questions, which we ask everybody. Are you up for some rapid fire questions, Tom?
Let's do this. I'll do my best.
Okay. So in one word, I would love to hear how you would describe the state of democracy around the world right now.
Fragile.
What's the biggest obstacle you see to people seeing themselves as world citizens rather than national citizens?
Time. I realize that none of us have enough of it, and we're all trying to keep up. And it takes time to just breathe and find out a little bit more information than you thought you had before.
What's one thing you do personally to stay emotionally regulated when you encounter deep political disagreement?
I consider those who are most vulnerable, and I've learned from when one witnesses a violent interaction in public or rupture moment, when somebody is being treated very unfairly by another, you don't try to stop the person who's doing the violation. You turn to the person who needs your support and you ask them, are you okay? That allyship is something that is a bit of a North Star for me.
Psychology or policy? So if you had to put more faith in one to fix the world's problems, which would it be?
Psychology or policy? I'm going to thread a needle, say both and transcend to art.
Who's your unexpected hero of world citizenship? Someone people might not immediately think of.
I see this as my opportunity to introduce a new person to you, everybody. I am deeply inspired by someone named Luscious Massacre, who is a Latina drag performer who speaks truth to power through heartbreaking storytelling, the humor of a ringmaster, the style of everyone's favorite auntie, and the depth of an elder. So if you have not heard about Luscious Massacre, you need to find about her in YouTube.
All right. I know what I'm doing straight after this. Thank you, Tom. What gives you genuine hope right now, even amidst so much division and instability?
Young people. That I have such a privilege, particularly in my job here at the University of Melbourne, to work with the next generation of teachers, the next generation of leaders and scholars. And when I'm working with people who have grown up with a phone in their hand and their ability to multitask in ways that us old people could never even think about or dream of, that their ability to find their way in this world is the coolest part of the work that I get to do now, and to support them to make a world much better than what we're leaving them.
Okay. Finish this sentence. This is the last one. Democracy will thrive when we learn to
take the time to understand both the somatic and value systems of those who have been systemically overlooked, minimized, or kept silent. And I often like saying, these are groups of people and individuals and people within intergenerational stories. They don't deserve our support. We owe them the very best of what we have. As a system, we owe them the best support. In my teacher language, we often talk about students with tier 3 needs, students that have complex unmet needs for learning. These are students that take up a lot of time. They need a lot of individualized support. And I like supporting teachers and schools and systems to say, guess what? If you've got complex unmet needs for learning, we owe you our very best.
Thank you, Tom. So lovely to hear all of those things, and I feel a deep resonance with virtually everything you shared there. Just, I guess, by way of closing, I would just love to hear maybe from each of us, just, I guess, any kind of concluding remarks on this conversation that we've had. And in addition to that, I would also love to hear just, I guess, what's alive for you from this conversation? What are you walking away with that's still alive in you? So whoever would like to go first, feel free to just jump in.
One of the most telling and powerful things, I think, in working in trauma and attachment over the years is the importance and power of a child connecting with one adult who cares for them, one adult who's interested in them, and that for a semester, a year. That contact can be transformative for that child. And I think that's what I've picked up from your last comments, Tom, just that aspirational and inspirational role of education in reaching out and connecting with people as a way to transform lives and to transform the society in which they're engaged.
I think it's important to ask people the big questions that they often don't consider, which is, as simple as, would you rather live on planet love or planet hate? Would you rather live in the world that we have today presented to us, or something that could be so much better? And I think the overwhelming majority of people are going to answer that they don't want to live on planet hate. They want to live on planet love. And then it's up to people like us, who are not completely bound by our jobs or by economic circumstances and others, to come up with elements and pathways that every individual everywhere can pursue that will lead us in that direction to create the planet of 8.2 billion people that we could actually do with the current amount of resources that we have. It's not an impossible dream. It's not esoteric, pie in the sky utopian thinking. It's very practical and very real. And if enough of us choose it, and enough of us have that exposure to others, that we see that it actually matters to you personally what happens on the other side of the world, and you truly embrace that and understand it. And if you didn't understand that in your whole life, you understand it now, because as Tom was saying about petrol prices, guess what? Something happening on the other side of the world has a direct impact on your commute today and your pocketbook wherever you live on the planet. And if that's not enough to convince you of the unified nature of our human experience, then we probably need another couple centuries to get there. But I mean, that's what I would say. Let's think positive, and let's think in forward-looking terms that are reachable and attainable.
And I would just like to add a big dose of gratitude for this dialogue. And that is what I realize time and time again when I have the privilege of having moments like we've had today, that the point is the dialogue. The point is to feel safe enough and aware enough to know how important it is while it's happening. And I just want to say thank you to the three of you for including me in this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, my checkout is this is such an honor. Each of you are heroes in my world in different ways, because I think you embody compassion, like enacted compassion in your own unique ways. And it gives me, we've talked about what keeps you going, what keeps you inspiring. Sitting with other people who've dedicated so much time to trying to solve these tricky problems, not for the sake of just solving a problem, but just so that it actually helps, those people who are born with the nervous systems and the heart rate that is so quick, as you were sharing, Tom, or Nigel, people who've escaped from domestic violence or institutional abuse in so many settings. And Scott, the people who've been displaced all around the world, like each in your own ways. I feel like you carry a piece of the puzzle of this vision for this brighter future. So it's so lovely to kind of sit together and talk about it. I definitely feel an infusion of inspiration and a renewed desire to go out there and in my own way do that, sometimes really difficult, but so important and so meaningful work. So thank you so much, Tom. Have loved to have you, and the care and thought and passion you've put into your responses. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching, everybody. This has been the first podcast of around 10 or 12 we're going to do in the run-up to the Democracy Mind program, which is coming out in October until December. So thanks again, Tom, for coming. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next time on Democracy Tomorrow.